Welcome to Inspirational Journeys, everyone. My name is Ann Harrison, and today I have the pleasure of speaking with my special guest, Susan Louise Gabriel. Welcome to the show, Susan.
Hi. Yeah, I'm very happy to be here.
I am so happy to have you. I do believe God placed you in my path for a reason. So first, before we get into the main part of the interview, there's a couple of things I ask people first, and then we see where the conversation and the Lord takes us. But first of all, why don't you introduce yourself to the listeners and the viewers?
Okay. As you said, I'm Susan Louise Gabriel. I usually just go by Susan Gabriel, but there's another author by that name. So I've used my middle names to differentiate. So, if you want to find me anywhere, it needs to be Susan Louise Gabriel. My husband and I live in the country. This is really my dream home, which is a very small, tiny home on an acre of land. It's very peaceful here. I love it. After some of the things that I went through earlier in my life, it's really wonderful to feel isolated, kind of away from the reach of forces out there that are, say, unpleasant. People who may want to coerce you to do what they want you to do. People who want to take your freedoms away, those kinds of things I've lived through. So for me, it's wonderful to be in the country and to be close to nature and feel like I can commune with God better here. So that's something I'm enjoying. We have 4 dogs we live with, and we also have 2 children and 3 grandchildren, and they don't live with us.
Oh, wow. Yeah. When I'm like, yes, Lord, when you said the country, I live in the country. I'm in Georgia, but I've lived in Atlanta, and then I've lived in Athens. I've lived in the cities before. And I'm gonna be honest, living city life is just too noisy for me too.
Me too.
And I have wind chimes outside of my yard right near my front porch. So.
Yeah, I've got the wind chimes too. I love it. And
Okay.
we've got toads. Our other pets are toads. We have many toads, which my husband worries about all the time. When it gets too hot and dry, he worries that the toads are going to die. So those are his pets.
Aw. So tell me, what inspired you to become a writer?
I've always liked to write. I always loved to read. I went to school a year earlier than actually I was supposed to. I was only 4 when I started school, kindergarten, and because I wanted to learn to read so bad. And back in those days, they told parents they should not teach children to read, that should be left up to the schools. So I guess my mother got tired of me badgering her to constantly read to me. So she got me in school a year early. And so I've always been a reader. I loved to read. I spent all my extra spare time in the library, and then I would write stories too. Some stories. I used to like fairy tales a lot. So sometimes I'd write a lot of fairy tales. I would get on kicks and write certain types of stories. So I've always been a writer. I just have never really thought too much about writing a book. I mean, it's one of those things you think about, you don't really take steps to doing until after this one very dramatic event occurred to my family that I've talked about in the book in the 80s. And so just a couple of years after that was resolved, I decided to try to write a book about the whole situation and all of the events. And I got partway done. And I just had to stop because I got to a point where I had to describe the most painful part to me. And it was just too painful to relive at that time. So I put everything away and I did not touch it really until about 2 years ago. And I would never have brought it back out again if it hadn't been for this particular person that I met online. Actually, there were two people. two. One was a teenage boy, and another one was a young man, and we just became pen pals, and we wrote to each other and asked questions and wanted to get to know each other. So as I was writing and talking about my life and explaining some of the bizarre episodes of situations, they both encouraged me, to write a book, to finish the book that I had started. So by the time I got through describing the things that had happened to me, I realized I already had written now an additional portion that I could use in a book. So I kind of went, and I happened to find accidentally, thank you, God, I happened to find the materials in the garage one day, all of the paperwork from the courts, everything, all of my manuscript and my notes. And so I brought him in, and I started putting the book together a couple of years ago.
Wow, that's amazing. And I love the poetry too. What inspired your poetry?
Well, that also was inspired by these two friends of mine. One of them is the teenager is really an excellent poet himself. And so he writes poetry. So I thought, well, that doesn't look so hard. So I started writing poetry too.
Oh my gosh.
So those are my two buddies online. Those, if I hadn't made those friends online, none of this would have happened. And of course, God brought them into my life. It's very, very obvious to me.
Oh yeah. I have a poetry story to tell you. The listeners have already heard this, but a friend of mine, I have to give kudos to my friend Jen Lowry, who does the Jen Lowry Writes podcast. Those of you who watch and listening, I'm giving a shout out. But she had a writing prompt a couple of years ago, or maybe it was 2020, and last year, or I don't remember. Anyway, the point was she had this writing prompt that was supposed to be a 50-word story about, she talked about these seashells, these long seashells she calls her niece called mermaid fingernails. Started trying to do the story, and I kept saying, I can't write poetry. This is rare. I don't, and the Holy Spirit's like, you can't, but I can. And I wrote 3 poems that day, and ever since then, they don't happen as much as fast as my fiction, but I have been writing poems off and on. I love writing.
Really, you use a different part of your brain when you write poetry, and it feels good. There's some muscle or some kind of brain area or cell activity that is inspired by the poetry and how a poem has to go together. That I don't think you use every day. I think it's something that is, sort of unused.
It's like when you try to write a poem, nothing happens. But when you're not expecting it, a poem or a haiku happens.
Yes.
So, and I don't want to spoil your story about, the injustice that was done with your daughter, Emily. But what do I want to ask there? I was going to ask you, did Emily ever come back home to you? But I read the story. You have to read the story for that. So what would you tell people who are going through the struggles that you went through? Or do you want to share, little bits and pieces of that first?
Yeah, I can do that. The first chapter in my book is really a giveaway of what this traumatic event is that I talk about. And that is that I was called at work one day, and the person on the phone told me they were with DSS and that they had my daughter and that I needed to come down to their facility. And I had no idea what they were talking about. But when I got there, they told me that they were holding my daughter, Emily, that they would not allow her to come back at home and live with me again until I kicked my husband out of the home and did not allow him any contact with her because she had claimed that he had sexually molested her. That's what they told me. And I was totally shocked. And I started asking questions, and I said, what did she say? How did this happen? And the social worker told me that he had tickled her, and I asked where, and she said on the stomach area and in the armpits. And that threw me because I mean that there's no real sexual molestation in something like that. And I knew they played together. They were playmates in that, you know, he was very active and she was very active, and she would climb on him like he was a jungle gym. And so they used to have a lot of fun together. He would, you know, because he's very you know, lighthearted and playful, and she loved that. So she always loved him. And when they took her away, she was devastated, and I was devastated. I was only allowed to see her 1 to 2 hours a week while I was being monitored by the Department of Social Services. So it was at their facility. I would go and sign in. They would bring her into a room where there were other people who were also visiting, and also a social worker who was watching and listening to everything that we said. And this went on for 2 years. Even after, and I can tell you now, my husband was eventually found not guilty, that the whole thing was extremely traumatic. And all of the events that led up to that were so, I mean, unbelievable. They're things that you would never think would happen or could happen. But it did. And it was 2 years before she was actually allowed to be around my husband again. And even after he was found not guilty, it was a monumental, distressing thing to me that I was completely convinced, and I still believe to this day, they were doing it to punish us, to get back at us, because I did not immediately believe them and kick him out of the house. I said, you know, I need to talk to him. We talked to a lawyer. They told me not to get a lawyer. They said that would make me look guilty, but we did talk to a lawyer, and we talked to a psychologist, and they both said, do not leave the home to Clark, because they will assume that you are guilty. And if I, you know, did anything to like say, oh, you have to leave the home, they would use that as a proof that I believed that he was guilty. So I was really stuck in the middle of a really, really difficult situation.
Sounds like they didn't want you to get a lawyer, because the lawyer would prove to them, would show them up for the fools they were. Excuse me for putting it that way, but that was just, when I read that, it was, I'm like, oh my gosh. And I have a daughter. I'm a divorced mom, but still, it's that just, even from the beginning, when you started the book that way and then went into your journey, you had me hooked. So has she been affected by that? I mean, I know she was affected then, but has she still had some effects from it to this day?
Yeah, she has. She has. In fact, her real name is not Emily, and because I want to protect her real identity, because this is still traumatic, you know, for both of my daughters. Yeah. So I changed their names, changed the name of my ex-husband. But especially my daughters, I mean, they've gone through therapy even as an adult. Both of them have been through therapy, lots of therapy. And it's just been a difficult thing to, you know, for all of us to live with. I finally got to a point where I had overcome my anger. I worked so hard at trying to change the system that I was able to channel my anger into something productive. And then I eventually, even though I got to a point where I told God I did not believe in him anymore, I was not going to. I was finished, and that if he wanted me to believe in him, he would have to prove to me that he was there. So I gave God an ultimatum, and he came through, and in so many different ways. He showed me he was there. And he does every day. Every day there are times, you know, and I'm feeling a little like, God, can you, I need help. I need your confidence again. Can you help me out? Show me something, do something. And he, every single time he comes through. I mean, I'm sure I'm one of his children that have caused him some problems. That he's had to take extra special care because I'm a little wayward at times.
I
But
think we all.
yeah, and you read the whole book, so you know the whole waywardness of the
Oh
whole
yeah,
thing.
yeah,
And it's
I do.
amazing that God has stuck with me
And pulled you back into His way, even with all the craziness.
I know there were so many times things could have gone the other direction. I should be dead. I mean, the things that happened, I definitely, it's a miracle that I'm alive. It's a miracle that I was able to actually write a book about everything and explain it. But I just every day I thank God, and I pray every moment that I have as a spare moment, and just try to connect with Him, and so that I can feel like I know what it is He wants me to do, because it's I always want to do what He wants me to do now. I do not want to go out and wander in that desert anymore ever again.
Yeah. And you wrote the book not only to share your story, but I believe to give parents who have dealt with the system, who are dealing with the system, victims of the system, hope.
Yes.
Hope.
Yes.
Yeah.
I did. I felt that this was really the time. I thought, why write this now? This is, 30 years ago, 40 years ago. It was a long time ago. How is it relevant? And then I realized it's very relevant, because so many parents nowadays are dealing with similar situations where they're having to fight a system or an institution to be able to raise their children the way that they believe that they want to raise their children, especially if it's in a godly way. There are so many forces opposing that nowadays that I think we all need to have strength and get strength from each other. So I was hoping that in telling my story, it would give other people the strength and inspiration to continue fighting for what they need to fight in their own experiences.
Yeah. I mean, I can see that. I could definitely see that, because, you are being the voice for those who feel like they have no voice in your book.
Yeah.
So go ahead.
I was going to say, yeah, because there were quite a few other people in similar situations, and they were afraid of the system. And I got to a point where I was, you couldn't shut me up. I told everybody about what had happened. And, I thought that was probably the only way to change things, was to uncover them. And that's one of the things that God did for me, was when I was not expecting it, He would put a Bible verse in, somehow injected into my life, whether it was someone had left a verse for me, or something that I heard on the radio, or something that popped into my mind. But one of the things that I kept getting was that nothing would be left covered, that everything would eventually come to light. And that was something that I really held on to, because it really was a situation where that whole system needed to come to light. It needed to be exposed.
Yeah. Wow.
And, yeah.
So switching to back to writing, and I do appreciate you sharing tidbits of your story, but tell me about your process. I mean, I know you had the court records and all of that, but did you have to do any extensive research?
I did, but a lot of the research that I did was in conjunction with trying to learn more about the child protection system, just because of the activism that I got into. So I had already done a lot of that. One of the things that my husband and I did during that period of time was we started writing newsletters, and then the newsletters turned into a magazine. So we were publishing a magazine. And I think the largest issue was like a 36 or 40 page magazine with stories, articles, So I would write, sometimes I wrote poetry in there. I wrote articles. A lot of the articles were maybe I interviewed someone, for example, and I wrote up their story. Or a couple of times I wrote one called Alan in Wonderland, which was kind of a takeoff on Alice in Wonderland, only it was a story about how Alan in Wonderland got caught into the child protection system. So, it was a really interesting creative outlet for me. And again, it was kind of a precursor, I think, to writing the book, because I was already writing about, the events that had taken place. And so I just had started writing. I kept writing. Now, another thing that's probably good to know about me is that I've been a writer professionally since about 1986, because I was a technical writer. I started as a technical writer. After I was an electronic technician, technical writer, then I started writing proposals. And I've been a proposal writer or proposal manager ever since. So, I've got 30 years of writing experience, but in many ways, that's not terribly helpful. It helps in that, I understand grammar very well, punctuation. I know how to follow, style guides. I know how to write my own style guide if I want to have someone write in a certain style. But technical writing is very different from the kind of writing that you would do in a book. So
Yeah.
I had to find my voice, because technical writing, you don't use contractions. That was one of the hardest things for me to start doing. And I still sometimes, I have to go back, and when I edit my stuff, I have to put contractions in because I'll say it is instead of it's, or he is instead of he's. And it sounds stilted. It sounds kind of formal and off-putting when you're trying to write, say, a novel or something. It's not, you don't want to use that kind of language. So the way that I found my voice was by writing to these two young men that I had become pen pals with. And I learned to write in my own voice. I learned to write the way that I talk. So that made things a lot more interesting to read, because now I'm telling a story. Now I'm not writing per se. I'm talking, but I'm talking and it's in print so that you can read it. And I'm hoping that you got that sensation that I was just telling you a story.
Yep. You were not, no, you didn't tell it. You showed it. You put it in there. I could see the whole thing play out. And the way you described it, it was wow. It was definitely, it would keep somebody engaged. And I could have finished it, and I should have finished it earlier, but I had to support another author that as you're hearing this, I had last week. She's a teenage author, and she wrote a fantasy. She's a critically acclaimed teen. She's a senior in high school, and she got her first publishing deal, not even a rejection. She got her first publishing deal when she submitted the manuscript to her agent. So
that's wonderful.
Yeah, that's a story. I'll have to send you that link too when it comes out. That's a story in itself. So
it turns out both my daughters and my granddaughter are all writers as well.
Really?
And my granddaughter, it reminded me when you talked about that, when she was a teenager, she also wrote a book, and she published it herself on Amazon. And it was a fantasy.
Oh, wow. That is so amazing.
So I've got all writers, all of us are writers, I guess, and I read someplace where there's such a thing as a writer gene or a grammar gene.
I wish I wish my daughter had that. I'm not kidding, because I love to write. I'm a writer myself. I'm working on a couple of projects. I finished the first draft of a children's book. This is National Novel Writing Month, by the way. And but I finished the first draft of a children's book during NaNoWriMo last Saturday. Well, the first Saturday, oh my gosh, what was it? Anyway, doesn't matter. When you're listening to this, it was at the end of the first week of NaNoWriMo. So anyway, but then it's like and then I've got a poetry book that I've written. And so I'm working on a couple of other projects. So yeah, I totally feel the sense of community here.
Mm-hmm.
And I am so blessed to be a part, to be a part of to meet new writers. And I was wondering, did your daughters ever publish anything? I'm curious now.
Well, my granddaughter, she did publish this book on Amazon. She's 22 now. So that's been a few years ago. My other daughter, her mother has actually written at least 3 novels that I know of, but she has not had enough courage to get them published. She's been busy. She's got a job as a technical writer as well. So she's been pretty busy, but I think if she ever gets any spare time, that she's definitely going to continue to pursue that.
Yeah.
And then again, my other daughter, she's a technical writer also.
Yeah. Get them in touch with me. I mean, if they have any I'm not a technical writer. I'm a professional writer, but I don't do the technical stuff, but that's not my thing.
Yeah.
But I love to write. I love I always encourage being a part of a community. So, I love to encourage other writers. That's amazing. So go ahead.
I was just saying, I really appreciate your having me on your show. That in itself is a great encouragement. So thank you.
And thank you for being here. So do you have any tips for new writers?
Right. There really is no other tip. I would say write at all different times of the day or night, whenever you feel like you want to write. Eventually, you'll probably find you're better at a certain time of the day or night. My most, let's say, successful writing is done early in the morning. Sometimes I get up at 3 a.m. and I will write for
like a friend of mine.
A few hours. and that's when I think, and I have heard this, but I think it's because of the critic in my brain just shuts off and it lets me just write. And then I can go back later and edit. And I like to edit. I enjoy rereading what I write, but I find I get bogged down if I am rereading it while I'm writing it. I need to try to just get it all down, like say one section of the writing, one chapter or whatever I'm working on. I just need to try to get all of that down because then my voice is going to come through. Then I go back later, set it aside and go back later and edit afterwards. But I know a lot of people do that. And I agree. I think that's a really good way to do things. I am not the biggest outliner when I go to write something like a book or a story. I will have a basic idea of what I want it to be and where I think the characters are going to go and what they're like. I might write a little bit down if I need to remember certain characteristics about each one of them. But I'm not really huge on outlining because I don't stick with it. My creative juices go a lot of times in another direction. And so the outline was useless.
I have to do some plotting because if I don't, I will be I tried pantsing. Well, I say that I'm what they call a plantser. The National Novel Writing Team calls a plantser because I've been planning in the revision process for this one book for my Christian supernatural thriller, Shadow of Truth. But then I pantsed the children's book. I pantsed it. So saying that I'm not a pantser is like saying I don't write.
Yeah.
So that's kind of funny. So where can people find you online?
You can find me. The easiest way is to go to my website, which is my name. So it's just Susan Louise Gabriel .com. And you can sign up for my newsletter there. You can also click on a link that'll take you over to my publishing company, which is where I've got a blog. And you can read more stories and more things that I've written and some things that my friend one of my friends, my online friends, has written as well. So I'm turning him into a writer too. And he's the one that was not the writer in the first place.
Oh,
But I'm forcing him to write, and he's doing a good job. He's from Nigeria, so his English is not, when I first met him, wasn't really super good, but he's improved so much, so tremendously since I've known him, and that, but just from talking to me, and I intentionally use big words with him because I'm increasing his vocabulary, and I'm sure he doesn't mind.
wow. Okay. So what are you working on now?
I am working on actually a second edition of this book, which is going to be a somewhat shorter version of the book. And I'm going to have some additional styles. Right now, it's just in ebook format. I'm going to have a paperback and a hardback, and I'm also going to do a large print format for people who might have some visual problems. Mm-hmm. My mother always bought large print books, so that is near and dear to my heart to get a large print book out there. And then I'm also doing a companion journal for the books, so that people who are in Bible studies or in book clubs would have something where they can record their thoughts, and there are prompts in the book that are related to the Wheels of Injustice book. And so that would be a companion journal. I have a ton of a ton of poetry that I want to get put into a book, and get the poetry published. Mm-hmm. And then beyond that, I've got a few other ideas that are percolating in my brain, but they have not yet, gotten solidified yet.
Journaling.
Yeah.
Journaling, that'll get them. You can put them down in a journal and flesh them out before you write them.
Yes, I do that all the time. Definitely. In fact, my friend, the one in Nigeria that I talk about, he actually, this is another part of my writing process that I'll talk about that has been extremely helpful to me. It's like journaling. There's 7 hours difference between us. So he goes to bed and I'm still awake. And so a lot of times I would just write a bunch of stuff to him, and as if it were a journal or a diary, just a lot of things, my thoughts. He's a Christian too. So a lot of thoughts that I have, ideas that I have, a lot of different things that I write to him. And then he will write back, and then he pretty much responds to each one of the things that I write about. And that response is amazingly helpful, because it's one thing to journal, but it's another thing to get a response to everything that you've said. So, I mean, to me, it's just been unbelievable, because I've journaled a lot in the past. I've had, like diaries and journals, and have written a lot, and it's helpful. But it's even more helpful when somebody says, hey, you said such and such. What did you really mean by that? And then I have to go back and think about it and explain it better. And then maybe when I'm explaining it better, I realize that I didn't really mean exactly the way I said it. And it opens up a whole new area for me to think about. So that, I would say, is probably the most valuable writing method that I have ever discovered. And I came across it by accident.
Wow.
But I highly recommend it. The process of finding a pen pal and somebody who is willing to ask you hard questions, and even not be afraid of making you mad, because you're going to have an honest conversation with each other. And nobody talks about doing that kind of thing much, and maybe I ought to write an article about it, but it's amazing. It really is.
Oh, okay. That does sound really, really interesting.
Mm-hmm. It really is.
So is there anything I missed that you wanted to touch on before we close?
No, just I hope people, if you feel so inclined to read my book, I really hope you do, because if you feel at least a little bit interested in it, I think you're being pulled in that direction for a reason. So
Yep.
I would encourage you, to check it out.
Ditto that. I agree to that too, because it was basically it was an eye opener of, not that I mean, I've never had to deal with something, but it's an eye opener. It basically gives you a glimpse of what this world can be like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that was just like the main event. But as you know now, there are a lot of surprises in the book, a lot of things that you will not expect. And I don't talk. Yeah, it is full of surprises. And so I don't talk about everything in the book when I do interviews, because I want to leave those things for surprise. But there are definitely some surprises.
But that's what keeps the reader engaged too.
Yeah.
And they say truth is stranger than fiction. I do believe.
And it is. It really is.
But God has a way of reaching the right people. In times like that. Yeah. So, and I like to ask, and I hope I'm not putting you on the spot, but do you have a Bible verse you want to share with us today?
All things work together for good to those who love God and are called according to his purpose. I hung on to that. Yeah. Romans 8:28. Yep.
And would you like to do the honor of closing us out in prayer?
Sure. I'd be very happy to. Dear Lord, thank you so much for bringing us together today, and bless all of the people who are listening to this podcast, and please extend the reach of this podcast. I know that you want additional people to be called into your kingdom. I know you want us to continue watering each other and blessing each other. So please help us to know exactly what to say when we write. Open our hearts and our minds to you, and send your Holy Spirit to join us as we continue to write and continue to commune with you. And in Jesus' name we ask this. Amen.
Amen. So we challenge you today to go out there and read, to get inspired, write something inspiring, and share your creation with the world. For when you've touched one life, you've touched thousands. Thanks for joining us on Inspirational Journeys. And remember, your story matters. Have a blessed day, everyone.